Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our Talking Points series. I want to address something that we see happening in the world around us, and it is a big point of contention, and it is, whose land is it? When it comes to the nation of Israel, it's being debated at the UN and in all the different places of who should have the rights to the land. It's become quite the hot button issue, really has been for more than 50 years. And so I think it's important that the church knows how to answer this. And before we even get into the topic, I will just say, before going into it, without spending a great deal of time, perhaps we'll do this in another segment, but I think it is kind of interesting that the church, some parts of it, actually don't even believe that Israel has the right to exist, and they don't even see them as significant in the biblical sense. And so this is where we get replacement theology from, which is just a heretical, horrible view, and it's led to such terrible treatment as far as the people living in Israel, and that their covenant would have been recognized by God as a forever thing, which we'll look at here as we look at our topic a little bit. But when it comes to this matter, again, who should be in the land? We know that much of the world looks at Israel and they call them the usurpers, and that they have thrown out the people, the quote Palestinians. And really, I challenge anybody before the middle part of last century, find me a group of people that were called Palestinians that had a government or a king or any kind of a function as a nation. They just called that area Palestine, and it's just a kind of a horrible way of calling it that anyway, because really the bottom line to this, the whole question really comes down to whose land is it? Well, it's God's land. That's the important part. So then let's answer this question. If it's God's land, if it's his, who did he give it to? There's the issue. So we can go ahead and let people fight all they want to about whose land is it from the people that are right here on the ground. You're missing the point if you get into that. It's God's land. He's the one who has given it to people. And I want to look at that kind of through the generations to answer the question, and then it will help us in our understanding in the world around us. So God makes everything, and the land at some point, at one particular point, we're going to look through the covenant given to Abraham. We are going to notice and recognize from his writing, or from the writing there in Genesis, that as God had given the land to Abraham, he gave it to him in two different ways. Not only did he give it to him in the sense of, I'm giving you the ground, the dirt, but I'm also giving it to you as a nation of people. And there is no way to remove the people from the land or the land from the people. The two things were given as a covenant. So the covenant was made between God and Abraham for a people and for a place where they would live. And so, as we read, let's take a look at some of these verses. In Genesis chapter 15 is the perfect place for us to begin. We have this back and forth that there is with God and with Abraham, and it starts really in chapter 15, where it tells us, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward." But Abraham said, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing that I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abraham said, "Look, you have given to me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one that will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside, and he said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed in the Lord, and the Lord accounted it to him as righteousness. So there's the first part of the covenant. There will be a people from you, from your line, and it will be a group of people that will be generations long, and it will be innumerable in number. You cannot number them. Now, notice this in verse 18. Now, on that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, another covenant entirely. "Your descendants, I make this to you and to your descendants, and I have given this land from the river in Egypt, the great river, and then the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." Those are all the people that are currently in the land. I've given you that land. So that answers two questions. The first of the covenants of the land and of the people was given to the very beginning of this nation, Abraham, Father Abraham, as we call him. But to the Jews, a much different thing. These are the people of the covenant, the Hebrew people, the ones who speak Hebrew, the ones who were later given the law in another covenant altogether. Now, we're going to get to that in just a moment. So I think it's pretty easy to see that we can settle in our own minds this understanding. God had made a covenant with Abraham, and it was to a people, and it was also then to a land that was allotted to them. This is a covenant that is 4,000 years old. Right now, currently, the big fight that's going on, though they will call themselves Palestinians, I think if anybody takes the time to look at it, this really is a religious battle that's going on, and it is between Judaism and Islam. The people who are contending with them, whether they be Jordanian or Egyptian or Syrian or Iranian or whoever you want to point to, those are all nations that have as their belief system behind their governments Islam. So that's where this is coming from. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, this is a religious issue. Maybe some of the people don't even realize why they're so incensed about this. It is a spiritual matter. So with that being said, as we look on a little bit further, this land is also brought up in chapter 26. Let's take a look there. Also in Genesis chapter 26, we read this. In verse 1, now there was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, in Gerar. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed the voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, what he says about you're going to be blessed, or the nations will be blessed because of you, that is a reiteration of what God said to Abraham in chapter 12. I will bless you, and I will bless those, or I bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and through you the nations will be blessed. We look back in hindsight and say that blessing came to fruition in the person of Jesus Christ, a Jewish man of the tribe of Judah. So from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to his sons, one of his sons being Judah, through his line comes Jesse, comes David, comes Jesus in the generations. So there's your real blessing. So I think even by those verses there, we can see that this was clearly a land given by God to what we would call the Hebrew people, the beginning of their nation through Abraham, now then down to Isaac. Now, as we understand this, knowing the history, Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, at the end of Jacob's life, he's regathered with his sons to Joseph, who he thought was dead, in Egypt. They remain there for 400 years, and at the end of those 400 years, it is a terrible time for the people of Israel, to the sons of Jacob and to the tribes. They're in bondage, they're in servitude. God leads them out through Moses, and they are brought to the land that they would ultimately inherit. So let's turn then to the book of Joshua. You can look through the whole book of Exodus. This is all about the land that is given to them and why God's taking them to that. You find it also in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. It is all about the giving of the law in preparation for them to go into the land that God had promised to them. So then we read in the book of Joshua. Now let's make sure we understand this. The nations being blessed, God promising the land. Let's remember, whether it's Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, they had lived in the land, there's no question, but it was never really something that they took as a possession. You can go back and look at their history. They were kind of nomadic. They went from place to place. By the time that they come out of the Exodus and they're ready to come into the land, they are a nation 2 million men strong, or 2 million people probably strong, ready to go in and take that. If that number is pretty close to accurate, somewhere in the 2 million, we know that they had 600,000+ men of fighting age. So if they had older men, younger men, daughters, wives, do the math. It's not that difficult for us to surmise that there had to be about 2 million people by the time that they come into the land. If that's the case, the nation now only boasts 7 million people. So it gives you an idea. This is a pretty formidable number of people coming into this land. But it was given to them as a promise that was realized hundreds of years later. So we know the history of that. Moses is the last of that generation that was in the wilderness to die off. And in go the children that were given as the promise, those ones that were from 20 years and younger. At the end of those 40 years, they are able to go in. And Joshua is one of the only two people, he and Caleb, who were over 20 years old when God said, I'm not letting all of you people go into the land because you're using your kids as the excuse for your unbelief and your cowardice. Except for Joshua and Caleb. They believed me when they spied out the land. Okay? Now Joshua is bringing them in. And God says to Joshua, Joshua was at Moses' right hand the whole time, and he's going to be the one who leads them in. Look at what God says to him. And let me point out one other thing. The covenant that was made with Abraham was with a people and a nation and the land in which they would live. What we have now is that same people, the covenant that was made with Abraham, are now a people that are also under covenant with this what's called the law. They were given the law of God, and here's how you are to conduct yourself now that you're in the land. You will govern yourselves according to my law. They were responsible before God, who actually finally put down everything acceptable to him in writing. So, listen to what he says to Joshua. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over the Jordan, you and all of this people, to the land that I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Okay? That should settle the issue right there. I am giving this land to them, the children of Israel. Verse 3 says this, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I had said to Moses. From the wilderness to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea, towards the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you, and I will not leave you nor forsake you. Heard Jesus say that before, haven't we? So I don't think it's difficult for us to establish the fact that God had given them the land. So whether it was Abraham, Isaac, whether it was to the time of Jacob, now the sons of Jacob and the tribes after those generations, now they're back in the land. And here, as they are led in, they would be there all the time, all the way to just shortly after the birth and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we're talking another 1,000 years they would occupy this land until they were finally driven out by the Romans. Jews have lived in this part of the world for 4,000 years. They have never left entirely. They have been broken up and they have disintegrated as a nation. An amazing thing, though, happened at the end of at the middle of last century, 1948, May the 14th. They became a nation again, and David Ben-Gurion declared such when they were able to take the city, or they were able to take a portion of Jerusalem, but they were able to overcome the nations that had attacked them, and they actually gained quite a bit of land. Now, ever since then, in the major wars that have happened, 67, 73, every time that they have been attacked, they have miraculously survived, and even more miraculously, they have taken back land. With that being the case, God has never given this land to anyone else, nor has he stood in the defense of the people of that land. He has also chastised the people of that land in ways he has never chastised any other group of people. Based upon their obedience or disobedience to his law, remember, he made a covenant with a specific group of people for a specific group of land, and there is nowhere else in the history of mankind where God has done such a thing. So what he has put in place, man cannot change that. They can try to, they can pass their laws, they can gripe, and they can complain. But let's look at one last thing, because, as I had mentioned earlier, they have had their times of good and times of bad. They've had their major being wiped out. since the days when they were brought into the land, all the way up until the kings. Remember, the first three kings of Israel were Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And when Solomon died, there were two men who took over, instead of it being the successive line to Rehoboam, who became a king of the southern tribes around Jerusalem. But up in the north, there was a man named Jeroboam, wicked man, did horrible things, and God judged the northern tribes. They were taken away by the Assyrians entirely. Now, the 10 tribes in the north never survived that. They never reapplied and were able to be brought back to the land. The southern tribes, however, were quite a bit different. They very easily could have fallen to the Assyrians. The Assyrians were at the very doorstep of Jerusalem during the time of Isaiah and Hezekiah. So that could very easily have fallen apart then. God intervened miraculously. But through a man named Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, because of the disobedience of the people, they were ultimately taken away in captivity. God restored them, beginning 70 years later through a man named Zerubbabel, and then later through Nehemiah and Ezra. And they were again back in the land, and things were kind of, as you could say, the way that they should be, until the time of Malachi, the last of the prophets. They had fallen into all kinds of horrible things. By this time, the Greeks were there, and the transition from the Persians to the Greeks, really from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, even the southern portion of the nation was never really fully autonomous, all the way up through the Romans, and then the Romans dispersing them throughout the world, and just that remnant was living there. Well, they're back in the land now. I believe it's completely a miraculous thing, and God has regathered them in what we would consider the typical of Israel, very much like the land that was given to Joshua. It just doesn't encroach into what is now modern day Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. But he very easily could if he wanted to. The day's going to come, he'll give them more land than that. But for right here and right now, to answer our question, whose land is it anyhow? Well, God's land, and we know who he has given it to. No matter who tries to make claim on it, we know who has it, and he has brought them back into that land, I would say miraculously. I want to look at one thing as we close out this topic. In the last two verses of the book of Amos, we read this in verse 14. God says, actually, let's look at verse 13. He says, "As behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows seed. The mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with it. I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink from them. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit from them. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land that I have given to them, says the Lord your God." That is about as definitive as it can possibly be. Now, we can say from the time that Amos wrote that, they've had times of being in the land and out of the land, in the land, out of the land. The day is going to come when he would gather them once again into the land. Let's remember, from 70 AD, they were really pretty much, as a people and as a nation, dispersed until 1948. So think about that. And here's the question that you would ask. Are we living in a world now where Israel is regathered into the land, and as God has said, the day is coming when the fulfillment of what we just read there will be genuine, and Israel will never be displaced again? I believe we're in that time, because for him to keep them out of the land for all of that time, those 1900 years, to bring them back now, and for them to be on their feet and really answering to no one, unlike the hundreds of years up until their final casting out at the hands of the Romans, they're in a much different position. Really, they're in a position that they haven't been in since the days of David and Solomon. Honestly, it really is that big of a jump as far as the years are concerned. So, whose land is it? It's God's land. Who did he give it to? He gave it to the Jews. As it is to this day, I believe he's brought them back, and I don't think that in fact, I go there. I've been there a number of times. The Jews would love to live in peace with the, quote, Palestinians, a title that's been given to them. There are people from all kinds of different nations who make up that opposition. But it is ultimately a land that was given by God to those people. If they want to point to Islam, God did not appoint Islam. Islam didn't come around until the 600s into the 700s is when Islam really kind of hit its stride. And let's make sure that we understand this to be true. That's 2,600 years after the covenant that was made to Abraham. So let's just put that idea out of our minds that it belongs to anybody but the Jews, the people who speak Hebrew, the people who look to the God of the Torah as the one who has brought them into the land and who gave it to them in the first place. If we're going to use the Bible to settle the issue then is settled. If we're going to try to make this a political thing, then people are going to try to usurp what God has done, but it's pretty clear to whom the land belongs. Until our next one, God bless you.